name is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography.
Harold Davis is the developer of a unique technique for photographing flowers for transparency. He's the creator of multi-raw processing and hand HDR processing. He is a Moab master and a Zeiss ambassador. Harold is an internationally known photographer and a sought-after workshop leader. His website is digitalfieldguide.com.
This is a very much a tell it like it is webinar. It's different from most of the webinars that we've given in that it is not fundamentally about the techniques of photography. It's more about travel and adventures rather than actually about the photography. And while I may be an expert on some aspects of photography, I'm definitely not an expert about walking on the Camino. The only real qualification I have is that I like to walk. And I like to walk with a camera. So I'm going to tell about my own experiences, and as we know, everyone's Camino is different. What I would say is that I've done two different treks on the Camino, one in 2018, one in 2019. Neither was the entire Camino Frances. Both were pieces of the Camino. And in a minute, I'll show a map of what's involved with the Camino itself. I was planned in May of this year to do another stretch for about 2 weeks along the Camino. Obviously, that didn't happen. And I'm very sad about that, but I hope once things pick up again to go there again and do some more walking on the Camino. I'm happy to try to answer any questions, but my gist here is to tell stories and tell things like they really were for me, and they really are. To that end, I've got a couple of excerpts from my diary at the time that I'll read when I get there. And without further ado, I'm gonna share my screen. So, can everyone see my screen? A Pilgrim's Whale of a Tale, Walking on the Camino by me, Harold Davis. And you know, the cover slide here is Gardens of Galicia with a raceseed field of yellow, wonderful flowers in the background and a somewhat cloudy day. A message from our sponsor: our new book, Creative Garden Photography, Making Great Photos of Flowers, Gardens, Landscapes, and the Beautiful World Around Us, is available now in ebook form with pre-order for the actual book from the publisher. The publisher's website is shown here. The discount code for a 40% discount is Garden40. And the same wonderful publisher, Rocky Nook, published our black and white book in 2019, and a discount code for that would be HDavis40 at checkout. This is a map scanned from a pilgrim's credential of many of the Camino routes in Europe over the years, that are some currently used, some not currently used. And it's worth pointing out that there are many different Caminos. So when you say the Camino, typically people are talking about the Camino Frances, which roughly speaking runs from the French border to Santiago de Compostela. But there are others, and one of them is the Camino Frances that I walked a good part of in 2019. The Camino Portuguese, which comes up from Portugal to the north to Santiago. If I had a pointer, I'd be pointing out things here. But the fact of the matter is that people came from all over the known world, all over Europe, from starting in the 800s and over the millennia to Santiago de Compostela on pilgrimage, particularly after it became too dangerous to go to Jerusalem. Santiago de Compostela became the most famous pilgrimage in the Christian world. And there were, as we'll get into in a bit, there were also geopolitical reasons for it becoming important. In some ways, it was also a safety valve in society. If you were a troublemaker in a little village somewhere in, I don't know, Bavaria or rural France, and they said, well, you got a choice. You can go on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela or go to jail in the stocks. I think that probably was pretty easy choice for many people. So it was also an outlet for people who had energy and were not very excited about living in their small villages places. In any case, you can see that there were roots going back centuries and millennia to small towns all over, as far away as Budapest, Scandinavia, the British Isles, and so on. The Camino Frances is about 500 miles to Santiago de Compostela in Galicia. So if you are walking the Camino and expect an American style wilderness long distance trail like the John Muir Trail or the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail, you will be sadly disappointed. It's not wilderness. And you will also miss the point of the whole thing, some of the great things. And you will miss also the opportunity to be fed great pilgrims food and have your bags toted from place to place for you and so on. A very, very different experience. People have been walking this trail for millennia, and the infrastructure is there to make a lot of things a lot easier. This is a copy of the cover page of my pilgrim's credential and the stamps in the book. The deal is that you're supposed to get 2 stamps a day so that when you present your pilgrim's credential in Santiago at the offices of the Pilgrim's Church office, you can get your Compostela or certificate that you completed it. The minimum distance to receive a Compostela is 100 kilometers on foot or horseback, or 200 kilometers on a bicycle. The walk must be done for spiritual or religious reasons. 100 kilometers is about 62 miles, is really not very much, is it? You know, I'm shall we say, a person of a certain age, and when I carry, even if I have support in terms of a suitcase being carried from place to place or something, I still like to carry my camera and tripod and a lens or two on my back during the day. You know, if I want to take time to photograph and set up that tripod somewhere more than a few times, actually, reasonably speaking, a 6 or 10 mile day is enough to get me fairly tired and sleep well at night. So maybe 100 kilometers is more than it sounds like. When you go into the offices in Santiago and to get your Compostela after you've done your walk and you're all happy and glad and maybe have some sort of sore feet, the scene there is that it's sort of like waiting online in an airport. There are literally hundreds of people waiting, and there's sort of traffic lights that send you to the right booth where you're interviewed. You've got a little form you check. I did this for spiritual, religious, or cultural reasons. And if you check cultural on that, you can't get your Compostela. The story I was told while I was waiting online was about somebody who had a friend from Germany who was a kind of wiseacre, a smarty arse, you might say. And when he was asked, he said, "Why did you do it?" He said, "I did it to lose weight." And I told him, "Get out of here. Don't come back." This is big business and many people. In 2019, they gave out 336,000 odd Compostela certificates. And it's been going up really for about 15 or 20 years at a fairly significant rate. There was a time, maybe 25 or 30 years ago, where there were only in the hundreds, but that stopped. Some of it has to do with that movie, The Way. Some of it has to do with people like me talking about how wonderful and enlightening and fun walking the Compostela is. For whatever reason, up until COVID-19, it's become increasingly popular. Note that while there are a significant number of Americans and English speakers on the trail, or were prior to 2020, we're not that overwhelmingly so. It's an international crowd. There were people from Japan when I've been there, people from New Zealand, and of course many people from Europe. 5 or 6% is enough, but not so much that you're going to run into people all the time from wherever you're from, if you're from here. This is the river Minho that runs through the town of Saria, which is where I started on my first trip in 2018. And I'm going to read from my diary at the time. Leaving the group at the Toulouse airport, I headed for Santiago de Compostela via Madrid. Unfortunately, Iberia wouldn't check my suitcase through, and I had to retrieve it in Madrid and recheck it. The service would be bringing the bag each night to where I'd be staying. So my plane from Toulouse to Madrid ran late, and then my bag got lost somewhere in the huge Madrid airport. I ended up having to race the entire length of Madrid Terminal 4 and was the last one on the plane, just as the doors were closing. Of course, my suitcase went AWOL, whereabouts unknown, and didn't make it with me. Well, a bit of hardship is probably a good way to begin a pilgrimage. It kind of seems fitting to be stripped to my essentials as I begin, although I do miss my tripod, which was packed in my suitcase. I'm hoping my suitcase will catch up with me sometime in the next 2 or 3 days at one of the places I'm staying along the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage trail. The airline promised to find me. On the fairly long drive from Santiago backwards to Saria, at first the road crossed and recrossed the trail. Then things thinned out and the vastness of the walk I'm undertaking became apparent to me. I think I discounted the distances when I planned this out from home. It took a while even by car to get here. In Saria, I had a nice dinner at a pub around the corner from my hotel and bought a second pair of socks for the hard-working feet, an inexpensive raincoat just in case, and certainly I needed it, and a clamshell, the pilgrimage symbol, to decorate my camera backpack. And this is a fairly typical, nice foresty scene along one of the more bucolic parts of the trail. Certainly, as you'll see, not all parts of the trail are peaceful and nice like this. Here's a river crossing. You can see other walkers on the bridge that's two down there. Here's a meeting of roads. The Camino is coming in on the right there and going back to where the camera is positioned. I'm not there with my camera to document anything in particular. In fact, this is a situation where the experience of being there is what it's about for me. The camera is incidental. I'm not going to leave the camera at home, but that's not what it's about for me. I don't have a particular goal when I do a pilgrimage trail about what exactly I'm going to photograph, what I'm after, what story I want to tell. I just sort of say, okay, it's a kind of meditation. And if I see something that interests me as I photograph it, I will certainly stop and make the photo. This is a planted agrarian forest along the way in Galicia with those even rows of trees that struck me because of the light brown leaves in the foreground. A monastery courtyard with a camellia tree not far out of Saria. More flowering trees along the way. This is a race seed field. This makes canola oil. With the reason that I photographed this, fundamentally the 3 trees in the background of the image that maybe don't show up all that well here. So I thought it was a neat pattern and pattern ending. This is a river that it was traditional for pilgrims to stop, take off their boots, and cool their feet in the water of the river as they crossed on an old Roman bridge. And so, of course, that's what I did. Felt good. More of the race seeds under the clouds of Galicia. Galicia is really a garden spot in Spain in the sense that it's not hot and dry as a lot of Spain is, as you think of Castile and Spain. It's closer in some ways in culture and weather to Ireland, perhaps with the Atlantic coast so nearby. This is a good slide. Life is a Camino. So not a bad way to think about things, both on the Camino and in life itself. Our lives are pilgrimages. And if we think of it that we're moving each day, before starting this webinar, I took a little Camino out to our garden. This is the bridge that separates Spain from Portugal on the Camino Portuguese. And I'm going to read again from my diary. Today I walked across the Ponte Rodo Ferroviaria de Valencia, shown in the image, across the River Miño from Tui in Galicia, Spain, to Valencia in Portugal and back again. Other than a little signage, just as you might have in the United States when leaving one state and entering another, there was nothing to show that this was once an international border. The old customs house and port of entry building on the Portugal side had been converted into a small art center and a music academy. I think when all is said and done, with whatever problems there is no going back to a divided Europe. Both sides of the river were heavily fortified starting in Roman times. I stood on the very top of the massive stone ramparts of the Portuguese walls and stared across the river at the fortified hilltop town of Tui, the capital of one of the 7 provinces that merged to form the ancient kingdom of Galicia. Tomorrow I start north on the famous Camino Portuguese trail. This pilgrimage trail leads to Santiago de Compostela through Galicia from the south, whereas the better known and more trafficked Camino Frances pilgrimage trail comes from the north. I should be in Santiago in a little less than 2 weeks, and I'm looking forward to it very much, although my feet are a little worried about the proposition. Well, the feet shouldn't have worried, it went fine. This is the image that I have in the background on my screen share right now as well, and I really like it. It was a very fun place to pass on the Camino, where somebody had built and architected basically a nice little garden in this crook of this incredibly ancient wall here. And this is the kind of treat that you get as you walk along. You see this kind of thing. You also, or at least did prior to COVID-19, get many free hugs and things like that. There are lots of people and lots of friendly, wonderful people, both the hosts and the people you meet from around the world while on the trail. So for me, that was one of the key things. I don't like walking in groups much. I like to walk by myself. What I did was called a self-guided trail both times. So I paid a travel agency to organize my nightly accommodations for me, and they gave me maps showing me where I had to walk to get to the places I was sleeping. They also did the luggage transfer and set me up with a breakfast and a pilgrim's dinner meal. I got lunch myself somewhere along the walk during the day, and so it's a very civilized way to travel. The only responsibility I really had was to wake up, get myself some breakfast, check out of the hotel, have my bag down at the front desk in time for the carrier to take it to the next place, and spend the day walking with my camera to the next destination and talking to people along the way and seeing sights to be seen and maybe doing side treks to see whatever there was. This is the curtains in the morning in one of the rooms I stayed in. As I said, I photograph whatever catches my eye. I'm not about to say, well, I'm on a pilgrimage trail, I'm only going to photograph spiritual things. along the way, there are various spots of people who want to feed you for the charitable act of feeding pilgrims primarily. Here's one place. You can see that there's a bucket in the basket which says donativo, donation, but nobody is going to bother you if you don't give a donation. Eat and take what you want, give a hug, get a hug, and continue on your way. This is sort of the national dish of Galicia, pulpa. It's octopus in olive oil and paprika. Very yummy. This is the national cake of Santiago. It's Santiago cake made with almond flour, a very nice presentation of this particular Santiago cake here on the fancy plate with a nice squiggle of chocolate matching the plate there on the right. And if you get a chance to have a genuine Santiago cake, I surely recommend it. It is truly delicious. And often when I was given the Pilgrim's menu in the evening, particularly in the littler places in the small villages, I'd be asked, do you want water or wine? Usually I'd take the wine. So here's the world reflected in one of those glasses of wine. I always felt that, hey, if I spent all day walking, I'm entitled to whatever intoxicating beverage of choice I feel like in the evening. And so apparently do many people walking along the Camino de Santiago. This is a bar on the Portuguese side of the border with Spain, and you'll notice that it's the last Portuguese bar on the Camino de Santiago. Well, you walk a mile or two further and there's a Spanish bar, so you could certainly do a Camino bar to bar if that's your idea of a religious or spiritual trail. And one thing I enjoy about walking on a trail such as the Camino is that it takes you around to places you might not see otherwise, even if those places are industrialized suburbs of somewhere. How would you know to drive past places like these, past factories in the back of Galicia, or rows of eucalyptus trees? They have the invasive eucalyptus trees just as much in Galicia as they do in California, and sometimes they actually look pretty nice to be photographed. Classically, travel is not about the destination, it's about the journey. And that's certainly true about a walk on the Camino, shown here an old farm and a water pump for thirsty pilgrims. A railroad bridge crossing, a footbridge across the tracks along the Camino. And you never know what you're going to see in one of these little villages. Here, there's the Ciudadano Rottweiler. I'm skipping ahead here. I'm not quite sure how this slide got here, but this is a triple spiral staircase in a converted nunnery in Santiago de Compostela, one of the world's two known triple spiral staircases. So, of course, I enjoyed photographing it greatly. The Camino Portuguese goes through this aqueduct bridge here beside this somewhat unfortunate canal, and there's a graffiti along the side. Some things are the same pretty much the world round, but if you're going to walk on this trail, you have to be prepared to walk through places like this and passages like this. The yellow arrow here. Following the caminos, the major caminos such as the Camino Francés or the Camino Portuguese, is fundamentally very easy. You've got clamshells to follow and yellow arrows pointing the way. The only times I ever got even slightly mixed up were in the outskirts of very big cities, and there occasionally you'd lose the arrows for a while. One point about this slide that makes it sort of interesting is that you've got a blue one going in the opposite direction. Well, this is not about the fact that blue and yellow are complementary colors. The blue is the arrow in the direction of the pilgrimage of Our Lady of Fatima, which is a Portuguese spiritual and religious pilgrimage that takes place during certain specific times of the year. So you've got some pilgrims going the blue direction and some going the yellow, and they in their opposite directions, and they pass each other. I'm going to read again from my diary here. Yesterday, I passed a group of monks with shaved heads singing Gregorian choirs a cappella along the Camino. So that brings to mind that it turns out that my biggest mistake in preparing for my Camino was musical. By way of background, I like to listen to music when I'm at home arranging flowers on the lightbox or working in Photoshop. Often I will pick a particular genre or performer. Though I may have spent weeks listening to Brahms and worked my way through Paul Simon, Bob Dylan, and Leonard Cohen, sometimes you want to get off on something else. The problem here is that I spent some time listening to Broadway musicals before I left home, specifically the original cast albums for The Sound of Music, The King and I, Fiddler on the Roof, and most deplorably, My Fair Lady, more than once, in fact, many times. These are not the tunes one wants running through one's head as one walks solo along the Camino de Santiago. Please no. Many of the melodies are catchy, part of the problem, and the lyrics seem sunny enough until the songs have run through one's brains in tandem with the rhythm of one's footsteps over and over and over again, and sunny begins to seem facile and fake. And yes, it really does rain in Spain, in my recent experience, considerably and heavily. I hate having these lyrics running through my head as I walk along. I really should have been listening to something more appropriate before heading off on my Camino, like Mozart's Requiem or the Missa Solemnis. Next time, I will certainly know better. This is a keyhole found, and in some ways this image illustrates the antiquity and layers of antiquity in the process of going through the parts of the Camino, because the big lock is older and a big old heavy door, and down below is a little teeny lock that's the more modern one. Outskirts of a Galician city somewhere, a bar with a witch on the cover. This was a kind of fancy hotel I stayed in with a nice looking couch and tile behind it. This was a hotel I stayed in off the Camino Portuguese where they put me up. I was the only guest, and this was my room, and it was a Galician nobleman's home is what it was, still occupied. The windows of a hotel room. Torre do Rio, Tower of the River. Really wonderful lodging in Galicia. A central square. Yes, as I said earlier, pilgrims on the Camino, tourists, pilgrims, were more than 6 billion euros to the Galician economy in 2017. The important source, and one of the things that the report that I looked up to get this number out of pointed out, is that many of the people who start as pilgrims come back as tourists. So they're so entranced with Galicia, which is truly an entrancing place. It's very understandable if that would happen. But this also points out what a global problem the pandemic is in some ways, because the whole Galician economy is depending on that. I mean, we can't go there. And I don't think even if I were in Europe, I would dare to right now. Phyllis, before I get into Santiago de Compostela, are there any questions that it would make sense for me to handle right now?
Sure, if you want. David has a question. What lenses did Harold take with him?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I try to pack light. A point here being that my luggage is being carried from place to place. I think they give you a 20 kilo or about 44 pound allowance in what goes in your suitcase. And that would cover a lot of sins. So I do pack some heavier glass in my suitcase, and that way I have it in the morning and in the afternoon. My plan would be, usually I would get up and out pretty early and hope to come into where I was staying by early afternoon, or mid-afternoon at the latest, so I'd have a lot of time to photograph at each destination. So I would pack the extra glass into the carried luggage. On my back, typically, I would carry, besides the tripod and stuff, I would carry my camera body, and I'm carrying these days a Nikon D850, and my sort of walk around lens, which is the Nikkor 28-300, which I characterize as a very good lens at almost all focal lengths, a huge variety of focal lengths, but excellent nowhere. I like it. It's kind of one lens to rule them all. But in terms of specialty lenses, I carry a macro lens, generally the Zeiss 50 millimeter, which is high quality and relatively lightweight for a Zeiss lens, and a extreme wide angle of some kind, which one has varied. Most recently, I've been carrying the Nikkor 8-15 millimeter rectilinear to round fisheye. And the reason for that lens choice is it's a lightweight lens, but has a fair amount of flexibility. The point about the macro and the fisheye lens really is they just give me capabilities I cannot get otherwise. I would recommend less is more. The additional pleasure one gets from going light is well worth sacrificing what might be opportunities. I mean, I hate to be carrying so much on my back that it made the trip unpleasant. Santiago, St. James, Compostela, Field of the Stars from Latin. It's the capital of the autonomous state of Galicia in the northwest of Spain, founded probably sometime in the 800s. Phyllis, I'm sorry I interrupted. Were there other questions I should get to before?
Nope, you've answered them all for now.
Perfect. So anyhow, it's an old place. It's an old and rather wonderful place. And Galicia is, a separate country in some ways. I'd say it's fair to say that the autonomous states of Spain are more separate in their own way than the states of the United States, although even many of ours are pretty separate, as we've discovered. So one of the things that you encounter on the Camino are Roman bridges, like this nice one, or this one.
How long have those bridges been there, Harold?
Oh, they've been there since Roman times. That would mean probably since 200 AD at the shortest, and perhaps longer than that.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing.
So 2,000 years ballpark. And they still work. Cars go over this one. This is another Roman bridge along the coast. It's where Napoleon finally met defeat in Spain and was kicked out. I forget the name of the place at the moment, but quite beautiful, as you can see, and quite stormy when I was there too. It was after this image was made, it just started raining buckets from the sky. So if you're going to hike in Galicia, you really have to be prepared for rain. It's a written and spoken language, is different from Spanish, or more so probably than Catalan or Basque. And here's an interesting factoid. The dictator Generalissimo Franco was born in Galicia and tried and failed to stamp it out as a living language. In fact, one of the things that happened thanks to Franco is that there were a generation of kids who did not learn Galician in the schools. So it's funny, their parents speak it and their kids speak it, but they don't speak it so much, at least in the written part of Galician. Fact or myth? Well, we're going to have a few fact or myths coming up, but before we get to the fact or myths, here's a wonderful person hall cover, a sewer cover hole, showing the famous clamshell in two different ways. Okay, you want to run a fact or myth, Phyllis?
Sure, I will. And we also have another question if you want.
Well, start the fact or myth and then I'll do the question.
All
the
right.
pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela and Finisterre was originally Christian. Fact or myth?
Here we go. Here comes the fact or myth poll.
And what's the question?
The question is from Sorov. Since there's a discussion of the lens, especially Nikon, so did you carry a Nikon DSLR or a mirrorless for the compact and portability?
I carried a Nikon D850. If I were to, but keep in mind that this goes back a couple of years before there were Nikon mirrorless. If I were to do it again, I would very carefully research the idea of carrying a Nikon Z7 mirrorless instead of the D850. But that's not something, since I'm currently sheltering in place, that I've arrived at a conclusion at.
All right. So
Great question, though. I mean, there's every reason on earth to minimize weight. There's some aspects of mirrorless that I'm not totally sold on yet, in that with some of my work, I truly like an optical viewfinder, but it's clearly the way the future is going to go. And certainly if you're carrying it on your back, it's something to be evaluated carefully.
all right.
Okay.
About half the people have voted on the myth or fact.
Go ahead.
Okay, and polling, and I'm going to share the results.
Myth, 65%, fact, 35%. The myth people are right. It was in fact a pilgrimage destination going back to Greek times. The origin of the clamshell goes to the goddess of love, Aphrodite, or Venus to the Latins. And it was one of the great number of pagan traditions in Europe that the Catholic Church took over and made their own. Finisterre, by the way, Land's End, or Fisterre in Galician, is about 30 miles beyond Santiago and is on the coast of the Atlantic. And many people continue on past Santiago and end their pilgrimage there. It's also worth noting that the civilizations that inhabited the Iberian Peninsula and Galicia predate Roman and Greek. This was some kind of almost Paleolithic civilization, probably 3,000 years old. The ruins shown here are in the middle of archaeology along the trail at the sort of summit of a little mound. Not all that much is known about the people who lived here, other than that they lived here a very long time ago and were fairly advanced. In fact, this pilgrimage dates to Greek times. Here's the spires of the Cathedral of St. James, Cathedral of Santiago, as seen through a skylight in the Pilgrimage Museum in Santiago de Compostela. If those of you who want to make a Compostela and arrive in Santiago should definitely include the Pilgrimage Museum as a must-see on your list there. It's got a lot of interesting and good information, and the best news is when you present your pilgrim's credential, it's free, as many things are. So Finisterre or Fisterre, Land's End, is the westernmost point in Europe. Fact or myth? This would be a myth. In fact, the most westernmost point of Europe is the Cabo de Roca in Portugal, where I've also been, and it's quite a wonderful place. But for practical purposes, Fisterra feels like the end of the world, and that's part of why Santiago was selected as a pilgrimage. For the first 700 years of the pilgrimage to Santiago, nobody really knew that there was anything beyond the Atlantic. And so part of what you were doing was you were walking to the end of the world and standing on the vast wind-stepped slopes of the Atlantic and looking out over the edge and to see the infinite. And that was part of what the pilgrimage was originally about. Here you see a place where you can get a stamp for your credential in Fisterra. It's the ultimate stamp, the last one. This is a rugged coast along the Atlantic. Here you see a lighthouse quite near on the next cape over from Fisterra. And you gotta believe that anything that's called the Coast of Death has its high points and low points. Costa da Morte, where you can get souvenirs embossed with that. It was the bottom of the storm-swept Bay of Biscayne, where thousands or tens of thousands of ships got wrecked on the leeward shore, driven in. So it was a beautiful but very storm-swept space. The lighthouses there date to the Roman era. I'm not going to ask you to run a fact or myth on this one, Phyllis. St. James was carried to Santiago de Compostela on a floating scallop shell after the ship with his sarcophagus sank. Hence, the scallop shell became a symbol of St. James and the Santiago pilgrimage. No, but it's an important symbol of the pilgrimage. Here it is on the side of the Cathedral of St. James in Santiago, a big one. I still have my scallop shell on my most used camera backpack and carry it around. And sometimes people say things about it to me, which is fun, really. I had someone here locally where I was walking around with it a couple of weeks ago, and they looked at me and they said, "You're pretty far off the Camino, aren't you, young fellow?" So there you go. People understand it. Actually, the scallop shell originated as a symbol of Venus and Aphrodite. One of the reasons that the pilgrimage was so encouraged was that in geopolitical terms, the Iberian Peninsula was for hundreds of years the frontier between Islam and Christianity. And many of the churches and religious buildings there did double duty as fortresses. You can clearly see that with the crenellations on this church. This one also, this is the Grand Cathedral in Tui, and it's a little, it looks very ornate underneath the rare twin organs here, but you can see how far up this cathedral goes, and it was connected to the encircling huge walls that fortified the whole place. So a lot of the military presence was Christian, specifically Catholic in nature, and that was why they partly wanted to populate the area and encourage the pilgrimage. I suppose this is a fact or myth. An alternative version of how St. James got to Galicia was that he was floated there in a stone sarcophagus. The body was found by a hermit named Pelagius in a dream after he saw strange lights in the sky that directed him. So the famous Bishop Theodemorus and King Alfonso II of Galicia, at the time it was a separate kingdom, built the initial shrine over St. James's body in the 800s, and King Alfonso was the first pilgrim. So there's a story, a tale, that if you kiss or hug the statue of St. James in the Cathedral of Santiago, the statue is part of his tomb, your health will be restored. I'm going to go back to my diary for a second. As I wandered about the interior of the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, I noticed a sign saying, "Embrace the Apostle." There was a line of people waiting behind a rope barrier in single file beneath the sign, so I added myself to the back of the queue. We inched forward, finally reaching the place where you went into the Apostles' area. By the way, in terms of apostles, we're talking about none other than St. James, the first of the apostles to be martyred. His remains seem to have turned up in this area somehow in the 9th century, with the tale of how they got here shredded in myth, legend, and the slaying of dragons. There was a stoplight contraption, and when it went green, the person at the head of the line went up a short and narrow flight of stairs. You can see this stoplight. It's a little dark, but you can see it to the right of the sign in this photo. It's iPhone capture. When it was my turn, I went up the stairs, then stood on a small stone step, and following the example of the person ahead of me, put my arm around a wooden paint and gilt bust of St. James. Unlike the person ahead of me, I didn't kiss the statue because I think I was afraid of that I might catch a disease or something, but I hugged with full passion. So I hugged an apostle, another first for a memorable Camino, not quite in the same league as Katy Perry's song, but still something. If you obtain a Compostela certificate, your sins will be forgiven. Phyllis, have you forgiven me? Here's my first Compostela certificate. You can
For what,
see.
dear?
Well, now you ask. Uh, here's a it's a I'm sorry. Here's a made out to Haroldum Davis. I was always surprised it wasn't Davisum.
And we have some questions when you have a minute.
I think this would be a good time.
Oh, okay. Cool. Don would like to know how much farther is Finisterre from the cathedral at Santiago? I presume Camino Trail pilgrims continue on foot.
Yes, many Camino Trail pilgrims continue on foot indeed. It's between 25 and 30 miles further. I myself drove and then walked once I got there. But, it also all depends on how much time you have apart from anything else.
And you can throw your boots into the sea, right, at the end?
Or burn them on the beach, which is another tradition.
There you go. And Carla says, my husband and I traced the Camino from Bilbao by motor coach last May. We would be interested in the company that made Harold's arrangements. And she also says, I discovered my family name in a plaza in Santiago de Compostela, Plaza de Quintana.
Hey, how cool is that? That's great. The company that I worked with is called Camino Ways, and they have a fairly well organized website.
And I think that's it for now.
Here's, speaking of plazas in Santiago, here's the Plaza of the Fountain of the Hippocampus, a rather pagan fountain, if I say so myself, right around the corner from the cathedral. And another photo of the spire of the Santiago Church. Another photo of the nunnery and museum that with the triple spiral stairs with a school class there for the day looking up at me as I photographed. Here's the church at sunrise from a distance, and here it is at sunset up close and personal from the square outside. I stayed as a very wonderful place to stay in Santiago when I got there after my first Camino at the Parador of the Los Reyes Católicos, which is a 5-star Parador billed as the oldest hotel in the world, originally founded as a hospital. And if you get the chance to stay there in Santiago, please do. It's really just a beyond marvelous place to stay and to photograph. It was, for much of its history up till about 100 years ago, a hospital. And this is these stained glass shadows on the wall here were up in the chapel where they put dying people above the church where they would lie and listen to the sacred music coming up as they passed away. And speaking of such things, this is here in the Bay Area of San Francisco. A friend, Alan, if you're there, a shout out to you, who took me by the other day at the Sunset Cemetery in El Cerrito, California. There's a person here who apparently loved to walk the Camino a great deal and had the symbols on his marker here after he passed away. So what is a pilgrimage? It's a good question. Besides my walks on the Camino, I've walked some other pilgrimage trails, most notably the Kamana Kodo to Shigondo Zen in Japan, this is a photo along the trail. It's many things. It's different things to different people. I'm still not entirely understanding what exactly it is to me, except that it's very important and it's personal. This is something that's about me, for me, and about learning to be a better person in the world and perhaps a better artist as well, and looking around and seeing and taking some time out of the space of the busy, busy world. Of course, it's a little less busy than it used to be, but that's another story. And approaching the ineffable. How do you work as an artist and try to get that element of something that can't be defined, something that's spiritual into your work? I think that spending time on pilgrimage trails have helped me do that. So that's part of why I've done there. Phyllis, if there are questions, this would be a good time to take them.
Yes, Banfield has a comment. Love your photography. We rented a car and drove and photographed the north coast of Spain. We often saw walkers and stayed where they stayed.
Good plan.
I think that's
Next time walk, maybe.
Yeah, but I think that's a neat way to go to explore.
Yeah.
And Dawn has the question, how difficult would it be for a vegetarian to be able to be accommodated? Any idea?
My impression is that every place that is a pilgrimage meal has a vegetarian option. You would certainly not be alone. I do think actually that even Camino Ways has that as an option in their menu choices. But again, I'm not really an authority on travel to that part of the world, but my impression is not a problem.
And that's it for now.
That's it for now.
Here's another one. Luke asks, if you get tired, are there transportation services to take you to the next stop?
Yeah, that's a great question, Luke. I always sort of, in the back of my mind, hoped there were. And I'm sure that at some level, you could always figure out a way to call a taxi or something. Languages can be a bit of an issue in that part of the world, honestly. I read somebody's blog about traveling the Camino where they expressed outrage that more people didn't speak English along there, but I think it's their country and why should they speak English? But be that as it may, a fair amount of English is not spoken in a lot of places. It's not 100% clear how you would do it, but I think one way or another you could, if you had to, you could dial up a taxi. I think if nothing else, if you went with an outfitter like Camino Ways, they have an always open number and you could call them and get help. I always did figure that if I ever got sufficiently tired, I could figure out a way to get from place to place. And I have also heard of people who've ridden basically with the luggage transporters instead of walking at all. Fundamentally, I'm sure there'd be ways. Not what they were exactly wasn't always clear to me.
Dawn has the question, did your luggage ever catch up with you? And
Good question.
And regarding the language, is cell coverage available so that one could use Google Translate?
Yeah, mostly I had cell coverage, and my coverage in the States is via Verizon, and I didn't have any particular problem with it. I'm not sure how good Google Translate would be, and I mean, in the small towns here, the language is Galician; it's not even Spanish. But to the extent that Google Translate does it, yeah, you can probably mostly reach it. There's an issue of what you pay for with the cell coverage. What I found is when I do the Verizon $10 a day global thing, it works pretty well all over the place, but that's an expensive option. And many people prefer to get sort of European beater phones and just connect locally, or a phone with a replaceable SIM card, not an iPhone, and do it that way. But fundamentally, I think you have phone options. Something to research in advance. My luggage caught up with me on day 4. By that point, I had got, how can I put this politely, pretty stinky. It turned out it was the weirdest thing. I'm glad I bought the raincoat and I'm glad I bought the extra socks. Both turned out to be very important to my well-being. And I was lucky I did, because store hours are not exactly what they are here. The timetable is that things are open in the morning, then there's a long shut from about noon to about maybe 3 p.m. And then things are open again going to 7 or 8. So, if you miss the open hours, you miss the open hours. And somehow the sporting goods store where I bought the poncho and the socks was open. I got it the evening before when I saw my suitcase wasn't with me. And it was good I did. But it did catch up with me. I came back from dinner on about day 4 and found it outside my hotel room in some mid-sized Galician place, and it was a fond reunion.
Andrea would like to know, how many photos did you take on the Frances?
I don't know. Not as many as you might think. I take photos during the day with my iPhone as well as my phone. I've never actually, cataloged them and added them up. Um, I do find that when I'm traveling with a group and teaching, I tend to take less photos than my students. Uh, you know, a few. I'm sorry not to be able to better quantify that, but that's about what it is.
Well, you just take photos when you feel like it. It's, the object's not the photography, the object is the journey, right?
Yeah, that is exactly right. And I really try to remember that and to enjoy the experience for what it is. And in all honesty, also, I have um, backpacked a great deal in the United States. True, I was younger, but I have walked the John Muir Trail. I've walked the bulk of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've walked solo across the trackless Brooks Range in northern Alaska myself, been dropped off by a bush plane and walked out to an Inuit village, not seeing a living person other than myself for 17 days. So, any level of hardship you might have on something like the Camino, there's no comparison. This is not wilderness walking. You know, this is easy listening walking in many ways.
Well, this area has been settled and lived on for millennia. So, it's so different from the United States in that regard.
And the infrastructure's in place. I mean, if I were to, there's a new Trans Bay Trail that's about 200 miles all the way around the San Francisco Bay, and they recently completed it with a bike footpath over the Richmond San Rafael Bridge, so you could really use it now. But if I were to do that, I would probably have to pick my own accommodations out and where I'm staying, and bringing a tent wouldn't be so easy because they're not going to allow you to pitch it just anywhere and all this kind of stuff. But if along the Camino de Santiago, they have it all worked out. I mean, good grief. They've had it worked out for over 1,000 years.
Carla would like to know, how did you decide which road you would take to Santiago?
Yeah, well, a good question to which I don't have a good answer. Part of the pleasure in travel, at least for me, is uh, looking at all kinds of different travel options. I mean, it's not just the being there, it's all the months ahead when you prepare and you think about it and you look through it and you say, what would be fun here? And, the people at Camino Ways are pretty nice about giving advice as well. And there are a lot of blog stories out there. And I guess this webinar will add the throng of Camino literature about what the good parts are. I mean, I didn't really want to do stretches of the Camino, which involve walking along beside highways in the hot sun for very long. So, I tried to pick good parts. The part that I was going to do this year, it was from Leon in Spain to Sarria. So basically my idea is to make up the pieces of the Camino Frances that I haven't done one by one, though not necessarily in order. There also are other parts along the oceans I'd like to do. And as somebody said, I'd also like to walk the pilgrimage trail in Italy. That's on my list of things I'd really like to do. I mean, even if I've been to the places in Italy that it goes nearby, I've been to Siena, I've been to Tuscany and so on, and traveled a fair amount there. You just see different things traveling this way, and that's part of what makes it so fun and so interesting and so enlightening. You see different things, you meet different people. It's just a different take on the world, and it's really nice to be around people who are doing things primarily for spiritual reasons, even if you don't believe in the specifics of their beliefs necessarily. There's a kindness and a globalism. I mean, I really had the feeling both times that I did this, that this is a world that can work. These are people who are getting along. I never met nasty people on the Camino. That stopped sharing, and now I'm live in front of my Gardens of the Camino picture, and bye for now.
enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.